Hello again, everyone. We are about to start our next session. So please take your seats. It will be a very exciting part of the program. We will hear a keynote address by Madina Tlostanova, and we are very honored to have this opportunity to present her lecture within our conference program. Madina is a decolonial thinker and a fiction writer, professor of postcolonial feminisms at the Department of Thematic Studies and Gender Studies Division at Linköping University in Sweden. Her research interests include onto-epistemic and aesthetic aspects of decolonial thought, intersection of the post-colonialist and post-socialist and post-colonial human condition, fiction and arts, critical future inquiries, and critical interventions into complexity, crisis, and change. One of the most cited scholars in her field, she has authored over 300 journal articles and book chapters, 13 scholarly monographs, and 4 co-edited volumes and special journal issues. Currently, she is working on a monograph, not by Leviathan alone, an exercise in post-nation state worlding. With that, please welcome Madina, and we are going to put her on the screen.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yes?
1 second. No? We can hear you, but we can't see you. Oh, yeah, we can see you now. Yes.
All right. Thank you very much for this generous introduction and also for inviting me to this amazing conference. I wish I could be with you there physically, but traveling overseas these days is not that easy. So I will be speaking from my Swedish darkness. It's already night here, as you can see. It's very dark. And it's not just any night, it's the Walpurgis night, which is very important in Swedish culture. The night with, a lot of dancing, drinking, jumping over the fire, some witches flying, you can notice here. So it creates a very interesting atmosphere for this talk. And I should probably say from the start, from the very beginning, that I was thrilled. I was very honored by this invitation, but at the same time, I was not sure. I was hesitant a bit of what I could possibly tell you about, because I had a chance today to check this amazing collection. It's really amazing, and it's really wonderful that now a lot of it is available online. But at the same time, I should say from the start that I'm not a specialist in art history at all. I'm interested in working with artists, and I do a lot of work with artists who are active now, rather than the art history. And I'm always learning a lot from these artists, and most of them do come from the former colonies of the Soviet Union. And so in that sense, we kind of, we intersect in our decolonial agendas, I guess. But in no way I claim to be a specialist in Soviet art. No, although, of course, I was always an avid museum goer from my childhood, and I have specific memories of various museums, Soviet and post-Soviet and anti-Soviet sometimes. So rather, probably I would be able to offer you some kind of decolonial critical reflections on what can be done to decolonize collections, to apply the decolonial lens, looking at certain collections and museums and exhibitions. And of course, these are not any kind of theoretical conclusions. These are just reflections, and you don't have to agree with them. But I would be very interested to hear your reactions to that, your questions, maybe your comments, your arguments against in the end. So let me still try to share something with you here. Right. Share. Can you see it? Yes? I hope so. All right. So, as I already started saying, there are some initial decolonial doubts. For example, when we use the term nonconformist art, which is a very well-known term, of course, and maybe central to any discussions of such collections. So then we have to ask, what do we mean by that? And from a decolonial perspective, what could be this art about, right? And then if we go deeper and maybe in a more radical sense, in a more radical way, we ask a question, can a deeply colonial institution like a museum or an exhibition really shape a narrative of dissent? To what extent is it possible? Because we are still doing it from within modernity and from within its main major knowledge production institutions, such as museums, such as exhibitions. And the splendor and poverty of mimicry, or what the artist did and can do, is a question that is formulated, as you can see, more from the artistic perspective, like what artists did, for example, in the Soviet years and the Soviet decades, or when they were coming from the so-called republics, national republics, but in fact, of course, colonies in most cases. So what were their strategies of coping with these difficult intersections of different discriminations, opacities, invisibilities, and also enforced modes and frames of how they should be artists, and in what sense and in what capacity they should be artists. So these were some initial questions that I started thinking about. And also, going back to this term nonconformist art, of course, I'm sure that you can tell me all about it, and you know the history of the term. Allegedly, it was coined by George Sherman in 1960, but I don't know. Maybe you have some other versions of the story. But in decolonial framing, it does not really hold water, as it attempts to lump together very different phenomena based on a vaguely defined principle of this unacceptability for and by the Soviet state. And here you can already see, if we look at it from a decolonial perspective, the ideological here is merged with aesthetics, but the whole spectrum of possible differences and deviations from the normative socialist realism, let's say, which, by the way, as you know, I'm sure by the 1960s has lost much of its original straightforwardness, then it's regarded predominantly through the aspect of conformity, right? Conformity, which is in itself quite fuzzy. I mean, how can we define this conformity to what and with what? And I can tell you again, going back to my own experience, I was trained as an Americanist. I wrote both of my dissertation about American literature, US literature. And I can tell you that in the Soviet Union, in the late Soviet times, we used also this doppelganger term, nonconformist and conformist or not conformist when discussing the US culture. And nonconformist was a very standard term favored by Soviet literary critics, for example, referring to J.D. Salinger's Protagonists. So it's also an interesting phenomenon how ideologically these were the two systems mirroring each other and sometimes using the same strategies coming from modernity coloniality, but with different ideological renderings, so to say. In decolonial optics, nonconformist art is a rather misleading term marked by this specific Cold War coloniality of knowledge and coloniality of sensing. And these are two concepts that are probably the most necessary to talk about in this case, right? So how this knowledge about art and art is shaped in a society, right? Who counts, who doesn't count, who's visible, who's not visible, what kind of compromises you have to deal with if you want to carve a space for yourself. And as a result, when we say nonconformist, or rather, as let's say, when people used to use this term previously, it glossed over many figures, events, artistic trends that did not fit into this simplified binary logic, or shoehorned them into one ideologically dominating frame. And that I see as one of the issues here, right? When we kind of try to formulate everything through ideological difference, and then we are not able to see many other elements here and shades. Importantly, we are dealing here with a less cannibalistic period of the Cold War, when despite the predominance of ideological differences, the demands of official aesthetics, official poetics were, of course, steadily eroding and expanding. The increasing cultural influence from outside the USSR was becoming inevitable, and artists not only mastered mimicry and the Sorbian language, but also, if we're talking about non-metropolitan artists, and this is what I'm trying to do here, artists who are perhaps most interesting for the decolonial option, they began to rely at first very shyly, very timidly, on their own national tropes, models, archetypes, distinct from Soviet and national Soviet framings. Therefore, I think we do need to decolonially kind of defamiliarize the concepts of nonconformism and shift our attention to additional, maybe division lines that do not necessarily overlap with the mainstream ideological partition that is still used sometimes when art critics discuss this kind of art. As a result of this, very often we find this imitativeness and derivativeness in relation to the Western post-Enlightenment canon, the emphasis on academic art and the academic element, the classical element, the deliberate erasure of ethnocultural elements, and sometimes defining them as primitive, not sufficiently developed, inconsistent with global and overtly or covertly cosmopolitan trends. So the national, in that sense, of course, existed in the Soviet art, but it could only be present there in the form of something archaic or some kind of role playing, when you actually use this difference in order to attract attention to yourself, but in very, very, very much prescribed forms. And this trend is not something of the past, because today in post-Soviet countries and post-Soviet traditions, I mean, in artistic schools, we find a lot of similar things. And I think it's interesting how these tendencies are revamped and reconsidered already in this post-colonial national period. For non-Russian colonial artists, the non-conformist tactics consisted of a maybe very different set of devices and tricks than for the metropolitan ones. It was more in tune with something that I would describe as passing for white for the American audiences, right? Assimilationist strategies of the early 20th century African-American authors, when this ontological difference was carefully erased. Often names were changed to sounding more Russian if we speak about the Soviet Union, right? Together with also trying to buy yourself a symbolic pass into the real art world, which of course could not be national. It could have been the then still rather hermetic world of Soviet art, which, however, was not at all reducible to just socialist realism. This Soviet aesthetic spectre was clearly invented, I would say, by analogy with the Western trajectories in contemporary art, but with artificially attached ideological bells and whistles. So the bells and whistles were always there, but what artists actually did could be very much in tune with the main global trends that were taking place in the world or elsewhere, let's say, right? Nevertheless, the main aesthetic categories, movements, techniques, and problems were recognizably increasingly modern, and contemporary in a global and not any specifically Soviet way. And here I on purpose give two very simple examples. One is Muhadin Kishev, who comes from my father's land, from Kabardino-Balkaria, and you can see in his, it's from the left, you can see how already in the Soviet period of his work, it's certainly not socialist realism, and some of his, experiments with color and with composition show that even depicting this kind of typical Soviet portraits, it was not already very very academic socialist realism, or even more so with Ural Tansegbaev, who are actually older and is one of the first, if not the first, Uzbek kind of oil painter, right, trained in this classical school. But you can see that it's not socialist realism, no matter how hard he tries to do that, or not tries maybe. And the typical elements that are usually or were usually associated with certain elements in Uzbek art, like ornamentalism, right, the notorious one, are already here or were always there, right? And so how they negotiated, even these not very well known maybe artists negotiated their relations with these main trends. And still in the last 3, I would say, Soviet decades, most non-Russian artists could only dream of entering the elite metropolitan artistic milieu within the USSR, with its notorious secret signs of contempt, this infamous figs in the pocket, and timid imitations of Western contemporary art, always a bit belated, of course. And here again, I remember my own experiences related to that. I remember very well from my student years the peculiar hermeticity, this derivativeness, and this aesthetic stagnation of these bubbles of supposedly contemporary art in Perestroika era Moscow, with its apartment exhibitions, sporadic public events just beginning to appear then, very often featuring Western curators, collectors, and patrons. This trend then evolved into very strange hybrids of hastily laundered Russian money and Western expertise and curatorship in institutions like Garage or now Guess 2. Yet, to go back to our main topic, perhaps, any direct interaction and dialogue with Western artists, curators, or museums, or critics, and the public was, of course, at that time nearly impossible for the Soviet colonial artists because of the multiple levels of coloniality characteristic of the Russian and Soviet model, within which Russia, as you know well, has always insisted on its very specific role as a mediator of modernity for the people and for the nations that had a misfortune of falling within the spectrum of its influence and is forever catching up empire. So basically we can say, and I insist on this formula, that first, these future republics were presumably decolonized from the Tsarist empire, but then the Soviet Union and the Bolsheviks very quickly, hastily recolonized them. But while doing that, they kind of tried to put it in the minds of the people that it was not a recolonization, it was a decolonization. And so, of course, all of these contradictions, let's say, were this or that way reflected and represented in the artworks that we're talking about. A key factor here was that the Soviet aesthetic model, despite the slogans of socialist realism and similar well-known cliches, with some nods to ornamentalization of the so-called austere style, as you can see here with Salahidin Aitbayev and Tair Salahov, more famous, maybe more well-known, or never went beyond the surface, was in fact deeply Euro-modern, let's say, in its foundations, and therefore colonial, of course. Or more simply, they were borrowed from the West and only slightly tweaked into this Russian or Soviet style way. Specifically, this refers to the modern colonial division between fine art that is real art, art with a capital letter, right? That's something that you see in a fine arts museum, and some sort of crafts or applied or decorative art, invariably perceived as worse, as inferior, not really art, something that has fallen out of modernity and is frozen in the eternal past. And this was, of course, precisely from this artificially imposed modern colonial paradigm that non-Russian artists sought to escape. I would say already in these last 3 decades of the Soviet Union, and especially later, when many of these countries became independent nation states. And this complex problematic had to be reinterpreted and kind of revisited in this post-colonial national context. I would say that in addition to this assimilationist strategy based on the erasure of colonial difference and potential entry into this larger world of contemporary art, initially anti-Soviet within the Soviet Union and then ideally global, let's say, right? There was also an opposing strategy for colonial Soviet and today post-Soviet artists. And this strategy consisted of drawing attention to their differences instead of assimilating, and their subsequent fair and not so fair exploitation, of these differences, right? So in some cases, it's self-orientalization, and others self-exoticization. And this could also involve moderate attempts to construct a matrix sanctioned by the party and the government that was national in its form, as you know, and socialist in its content, right? With the inevitable increasing efforts to somehow smuggle, some elements of ethnic cultural specificity or even maybe indigenous cosmologies in some cases into this allowed frame in a variety of nonconformist forms. But this nonconformism was different from the mainstream ideological nonconformism of metropolitan artists. And this is what I wanted to maybe stress here specifically. There were also anti-colonial works already in the late Soviet period that completely fell outside the Soviet paradigm and stemmed from these ethnic national cosmologies and ways of worlding, which paradoxically and often intuitively were able to capture, let's say, the vibes of global anti-colonial sensitivities in contemporary art, although why I say paradoxically and why intuitively, because in most cases, these artists didn't know much about it at all. Yeah, they mostly didn't have direct access to such works. All these works were misinterpreted and appropriated by the official Soviet ideology. Because again, as you probably know or remember, the Soviet Union actually appropriated anti-colonial problematic and agenda very well. So some of these anti-colonial artists, films, activists, they were present, in this Soviet kind of discourses. But the way, again, they were interpreted was very convenient for the Soviet regime. Still, in the closing Soviet decades, the metropolitan and colonial artists alike were mostly preoccupied with learning about the global art scene rather than insisting on their own specificity. And this is also, I think, a very important shift that we need to take into account. In this regard, I want to remind you of a very typical late Soviet phenomenon of avid learning about Western art, first of all, Western culture, from the critical and the ideologically overloaded books written by some mediocre Soviet critics attacking the so-called bourgeois culture. You can see one of the examples here. So I remember we had books like that at home. My parents used to buy them, but none of us ever paid attention to their crappy critique, but everyone eagerly searched for names, titles, reproductions, film stills in order to learn more about the global trends and developments in the world culture, so to say, right? That everything outside of the Soviet Union. And the same refers, of course, to this anti-colonial trend, so to say. But as I said, the difficulty here was that it was not just ideological, this difference, but it was also connected with this appropriation of anti-colonial agenda and post-colonial agenda by the Soviet regime. And of course, both then and especially maybe now in the post-Soviet period, the emphasis on difference could easily slip and is slipping into self-orientalization, self-exoticization, and this ironic exploitation of the image of the savage. Ironic in most cases, I would say, because when we take people like Almagul Menlibayev, a wonderful Kazakhstani artist, or Faig Ahmed from Azerbaijan, I think it is already very postmodern, very meta-critique, so they consciously play with these tropes of self-orientalization and do it ironically, and this ensures relatively easy also and rapid entry into the global art market, although it certainly limits the authors to specific narrow and flat identities, even if they attempt to play with it in certain critical ways. So this also brings us to this new kind of era, and what and it makes us ask the question: what actually changed? What are the actual shifts from the Soviet unfreedom to the current neoliberal unfreedom? Let us reiterate then that the divisions within the Soviet art during the last 30 years of the USSR and the initial decades of the post-Soviet period are not really reducible to the ideological cliché of conformity, but rather they have, among other things, a clearly expressed colonial subtext, or let's say colonial underside. However, the post-colonial and even more so the decolonial view of this problematic has entered the art scene with a huge lag. And the task of rethinking the Soviet and post-Soviet artistic heritage from this decolonial perspective, or even post-colonial for that matter, not merely from the viewpoint of mainstream art history, remains still a task for the future. I myself started thinking about it long ago. Actually, I think at the moment when the Soviet Union collapsed and this new country came into being, the Russian Federation, which in many ways attempted to be different from the Soviet Union. But one thing that was very important for me and for people like me who were not Russian ethnically, and therefore we already were seen as inferior and not belonging. And at the same time, we were not offered any other political identity except for becoming Russian, assimilating into Russianness, and accepting it as like something that we have to become or can never become, because we are not the same as Russians, So this is what triggered me at that point in the early 90s to start thinking about it and to start trying to play with some post-colonial and then decolonial concepts and seeing if they fit into this and how can they help us define who we are in this country, and do we have the right to exist, and on what terms. And the same was true about many writers, like non-Russian writers writing in Russian, for instance, right, in a very kind of typical post-colonial way, or artists or filmmakers. The 90s in that sense was the first maybe attempt to do that, but it was the attempt from the creators themselves rather than from critics. The critics remained totally oblivious to this until maybe 5 years ago, or a bit maybe more than that, 7 years. But until like 2015, everything I was writing about it was not accepted and not acceptable within this kind of Russian critical theoretical modes. while the artists themselves, as I said, they were doing it already, and sometimes they didn't have a language for that. They didn't know how to what kind of term to use, but you can see it clearly in their works. And not only the newer works, but also the works that were created like maybe 40 years ago or so. And some of these examples you can see here, how it's not only about the the dialogues and some echoes with the larger movements in art that were happening elsewhere, not in the Soviet Union, but it's also rediscovering, and this is very decolonial, rediscovering and reconnecting with their own vibes, indigenous vibes, national cultures. National identities. And this is a process that also does not coincide simply with perestroika, with the collapse of the Soviet Union. It starts a little bit earlier, because already in the 1970s and the 1980s especially, we see it in most actually national republics. One of the interesting examples is Ibrahim Khalil Supyanov, from Dagestan. And very often critics used to say that he's an abstractionist, and so easily sliding into connecting him with abstract expressionism, for instance, right? Because this is the kind of hermeneutical horizon that would work for an art critic who was brought up within the Western paradigm. But it's not just that, although this probably is also there because he's a very educated artist, right? And he knows what he's doing and who is his interlocutor, so to say. But he's also from Dagestan. And so this connection with Dagestani visual cultures and the ways these ornaments were used, this kind of symbols were used traditionally in a culture where you were not allowed, let's say, to depict human faces or animals, right? So there were other ways, more interesting and maybe less obvious, less representational, that worked. And so that is, to me, an interesting thing when something like that happens, when there is some continuation of the local visual language, let's say, right, and hermeneutical language also, that connects in interesting ways with these global traditions like abstract expressionism. The specific interest of Western museums and art institutions in Soviet colonial and post-Soviet post-colonial art perhaps also deserves some decolonial commentary. Western museums and collectors, when purchasing and exhibiting this art during the Cold War, operated primarily again within the same ideological dichotomy. The question of saving these works of art and sometimes also assisting their creators was, of course, Cold War related. And the internal divisions of what was commonly called Soviet, as well as the rigid hierarchies of the Soviet metropolis and its colonies, were rarely considered as maybe important, crucial, rather than merely a matter of tick boxing, unless, of course, the focus was on some kind of form of multiculturalism. It could be purely theatrical, it could be more serious, it could be based on exoticization as a strategy, or not. And there were exceptions as well, of course. As a result, the colonial Soviet artists found themselves very much trapped in a vicious circle of prescribed representations of what they were allowed to be or not. The situation has changed little today, although there are some signs that it's finally, belatedly starting to change. But it has become clear to the post-Soviet, post-colonial authors that they are not alone, that they have shared the fate of many other post-colonial artists, doomed either to be Ariels and forever play the role of Calibans, to entertain the public, the audience, or to unsuccessfully strive to become second-rate prosperers, which, of course, they are usually not allowed to be. And this bitter feeling we find not only in Soviet art, like Soviet colonial art, but we also find it in broader contexts, which is exemplified here by two works. One is a famous photograph by Yves Klein that I'm sure all of you know about. It's a classical case by now, right? And the other one is trying to replay the whole thing, but in an ironic way and in a very, I would say, post-colonial way. It's Ciprian Mureșan, who is an artist from Romania. So he takes the same kind of similar photograph, but calls it Leap into the Void 4 seconds later, and which you can see that the artist actually is not flying, and the whole thing does not symbolize freedom and flying, but rather he's flat on the ground. So that was also an interesting thing, that the first artists who actually discovered post-colonial theory first and then decolonial and attempted to kind of, conceptualize their own condition, human condition, after the collapse of the socialist world, were these Eastern European and Balkan artists who started using some of the categories from the post-colonial theory and toolbox. And then a bit later, they were joined by artists from the former Soviet republics. And today, as you know, it has become very popular and sometimes scary. I don't really like the way some people use today the word decolonial and decolonize. It completely loses its critical edge. It's appropriated by all sorts of people from all sorts of, political persuasions. But at the same time, this is a famous work by Yerbasin Meldibekov, my brother, my enemy. That was, I think, in Venice Biennale. So that's one of the good examples in that sense. Once again, we should say that there is this unique combination of ideological and colonial oppressions in the context of post-Soviet, post-colonial art, a phenomenon still rarely recognized or rarely taken into account. And also at play here are two distinct versions of modernity, both of them marked by their dark colonial sides, yet they are mutually antagonistic. And this creates the uniqueness of the situation. And artists can choose then this Russian Soviet modernity as an ideal, or maybe as an opponent, or Western global modernity. In both cases, there will be some misunderstanding, some partial invisibility, of course, some efforts to assimilate. Although they're not symmetrical, of course, because the larger global modernity is one thing, and this weird Soviet version is a completely a different scale. The latest Soviet generation of non-Russian artists who subsequently integrated into the post-Soviet context constantly attempted and continue to attempt to engage in such a dialogue and debate directly with global modernity coloniality. And that's an interesting shift. So they're trying to go directly to the larger modernity, bypassing the previously necessary Russian mediation. And I think this is a very interesting development, and it needs to be kind of, analyzed in more detail. This could again be a relationship of assimilation and adaptation, but also a truly decolonial impulse for which the Russian art scene has long struggled to find a language, as I said already, or appropriate interpretative tools. And for example, I can give you one example. About 15 years ago, there was one of the first solo exhibitions of the Buryat artist Zorik Todorjiv in Moscow. And I was there, and I was fascinated with his works. But to me, it was clearly a very post-colonial way of using art, and playing with certain specific artistic devices. But the art critics who were there, they debated the merits of his oil painting techniques, but completely overlooked the elephant in the room, his ironic canonical counter-discourse to the Western painting canon. Which to me is quite obvious. Like, look at this, for example, Gioconda Khatun, or this. It's a clear case of canonical counter-discourse that you can find in so many post-colonial works. But nobody was able to kind of pinpoint it and talk about that. Now the situation has changed also, but is, as I said, it's very belated. In recent years, when attempting to directly access global art markets, exhibitions, and museum private collections, these post-Soviet / post-colonial artists have faced a real boom in decolonial discourses, although in many cases it was simplified and depoliticized. And in this new context, their art seems much more appropriate and able to find its place as the former Cold War homogenization and blindness to colonial differences are gradually disappearing, and more people and institutions become aware that the Soviet encompassed more than just the metropolis and just Russian, Moreover, today's non-Russian artists who are based in Russia, not to mention the art of former Soviet countries, which have long since even abandoned this label. They don't want to be called post-Soviet, and I understand them. It often lacks this, again, direct relationship to any Russian matrices or engages in conscious debate with them, while still enjoying today, of course, this access to global debates on the coloniality of being, perception, thinking. However, right up until Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, many of these artists still seemed to play sort of on two fronts, and you would find their works both in Russia and in the West. And situation is now, of course, also changing due to more harsh politics in relation to these Russian institutions. Many of them are cancelled, so to say. And here you can see, for example, Garage Museum was one of the places where people were actually exhibiting their works if they were coming from Central Asia until very recently. I think even in the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, they were still doing it. But sometimes they were doing it kind of tongue-in-cheek. One of the examples in the bottom here from Mildibekov again is called Transformer. And it was right in front of the Garage Museum, and it's a very loaded thing. He's playing with monuments. He's trying to show, as in many of his works, that monuments are actually assemblages, and they don't mean much, and they can mean anything. And ideologically, you can reassemble them from the same parts, and they could mean anything. And that thing placed in front of the Garage Museum in Moscow, of course, was also overloaded and additionally loaded with some ironic comments, although maybe subtle and not so blunt, let's say, right? And in my view, when attempting to understand the meaning of decoloniality in the context of contemporary art and the attempts of post-Soviet, post-colonial others to fit into this context, it is important to adhere to the key decolonial principle, which I think many people miss: the need to change not only the content, but also the terms of the conversation, rather than mechanically adding just new names or works to the corpus of Russian Soviet metropolitan art without changing the categories, the relationality, the logic itself. In this sense, the current Ukrainian campaign to change museum plaques in major institutions and restore the local and cultural identification and genealogy of famous artists is very important. Although I still think that it's only the first step on a long decolonial journey if we speak about museums. And in that sense, of course, we could go back to these efforts of decolonizing museums that were very popular for a while. 10 years ago, everybody was talking about that. There were several good publications, including collections of curators, famous art critics. And there were also artists, again, coming from the colonies and former colonies of the Soviet Union who dealt with it, like Taus Makhacheva, again, another Dagestani amazing conceptual artist and also decolonial in many ways, who worked with this, the way of an object, and her. It was one of her first examples of decolonizing museums. And then this work that you might know well because it was all over Europe and many places. And it's part of a larger project, the Tightrope, in which this tightrope walker is taking the copies, of course, not the originals, of the paintings that, let's say, represent the history of Dagestani oil painting mostly, but also I think drawings from the 20th century. So he's taking them from one mountain to the other. And I will show you just a very short clip, maybe like 30 seconds.
For me,
Okay, so you get the idea. And that is, of course, a very critical reflection of what is a museum, or what is a collection, and what do we do with it, and how we preserve it, and how fragile it is. But also how to take this whole thing outside of the white cube, so to say, right? And take it very often, in Taus Makhacheva's case, it's towards the mountains, towards nature and real life, and that is one of the topics that emerges very often today in discussions of decolonizing the museum. To sum up, I'd say that for a Western museum, biennial, or other global art institution to claim the role of shaping the narratives of dissent, they themselves must first cease to be modern colonial institutions. And this is very hard. It's virtually impossible. For this would mean completely dismantling such institutions and creating something else in their place. Therefore, for now, let's say it's only possible to talk about creating and supporting local, small decolonial cracks and fissures, various artistic and curatorial models of tricksterism, from the belly of the beast, right? We're still talking from the belly of the beast. And this is already great. It's already admirable in today's conditions of the global polycrisis, of geopolitical conflicts, climate change, technological coloniality. Still, the vulnerable position of a trickster that we all practice to this or that extent demands perpetual compromises from the curators, from the artists, right, from art critics, from those who keep these collections. And at least until modernity dies in its hospice, to follow Machado de Oliveira's famous metaphor, there is no other option for us. And it's amazing that it's possible to actually work with these wonderful collections like your collection in this museum and try to do something on a smaller scale, but at the same time from within these cracks, decolonial cracks, that we still can do it. And let's hope that it will be possible in the future. Okay, and I just finished with another wonderful picture, painting by Zorik Todorjiev. Thank you very much.
Is it on? Yes. Thank you very much, Madina. I think we have can take questions from the audience. Questions? Oh, okay. I had. Well, maybe then I will ask to elaborate a little bit. You were talking about self-orientalization by the artist working in countries that were former Soviet Republic under the Soviet rule, but at the same time it is my understanding that the strategy of kind of there was a possibility and strategy to pass for national trends certain kind of modernist tendencies and kind of smuggle them into an official art discourse under the disguise of national features and kind of introduce more of a modernist trends. And I was wondering if you have, if you can comment a little bit more on that. Yes, pretty much that's my question. That's the first one that I have.
Okay, thank you very much. I think there are several things here together. Like when I was speaking about self-orientalization, I probably meant more the current post-Soviet artists already, right? Because as I said, they're struggling to become part of the larger art scene, to sell their works, you know, to be represented in museums. And one of the very few ways they can do it is to precisely do that, to exoticize themselves and to be offered to this kind of art market, the global art market, in this capacity of these savages. But of course, I'm not speaking in a serious way, right? Because they're also doing it very ironically, and everybody realizes that it's not serious. But they have to be exotic, and so they have to play on this exoticization. And in the Soviet years, there was a different kind of exoticization if we were speaking about within the country, whereas it's a different thing if it's for expert. So to say. So there is this gap between the ones that are made specifically for abroad and the ones for this internal multiculturalist usage, so to say. Also, I would argue that a lot of artists were putting on a specific identity on themselves, trying to play this role, right? Like I'm allowed to be the singer of my native land or whatever, and I may be allowed to be ornamentalist, for example, if I'm from Uzbekistan, right? Or something like that. But you're right, they were also, especially if we're talking about the late Soviet period, not the early, but we are speaking about the 60s to 90s, right? Mostly. These were already people with a good education, you know, with some knowledge of global art. And so, of course, as we said, some interest in learning more about Western global trends, and not necessarily Western, but just what was happening outside the USSR, so to say. And so they merged. So you can't really say that they kind of took modernism and put it to their art. No, I think that they rather found some echoes, some similarities. So, you know, it's more interesting to see how some of this ornamentalism accidentally or incidentally rhymes with whatever was fashionable at that point in the West. But it's not necessarily about smuggling it, and it's not necessarily about copying it or mimicking it, but rather rediscovering all of a sudden that there are some global things and global trends and some shifts and some interests. And the same is in literature also. You all of a sudden discover that some Soviet writers actually were interested in existentialism, not because they were copying Camus or Sartre, but because it was just maybe in the air. You know, it was the something that people dealt with at that point, no matter where they lived. But yes, it's very interesting to kind of disentangle it and see how there are some influences and some dialogues with modernist trends, for example, right? But at the same time, this rediscovering of their own traditions and something that I would say that that's a very interesting thing, that it's not a tradition in a bad sense, how modernity usually interprets tradition, like something traditional is by definition, by default, bad in modern thinking. But no, in this sense, the tradition is living, changing, and improvisational, and it's not something dead and archaic from the past. And I think that was important when this artist realized that you can be modernist, but also play with these elements of tradition in very kind of positive ways, in very generative ways, I would say.
Yes, absolutely. I will take the questions from the audience. I just wanted to say that this strategy of self-orientalization is an old one, and Digilev's ballet were entirely based on that. So I will pass on the mic.
Hello. Thanks a lot for your thought-provoking presentation. I'm from Ukraine, and in our part of the world, decolonization became a quite problematic buzzword these days, as you probably are aware of. And I have very mixed feelings towards it, because on the one hand, as you mentioned, the movement to change the tags in the museums is very interesting and very useful and very important. But at the same time, we very often end up with outright nationalism, conservatism, and right-wing rhetorics, which is masking with decolonial language. And that is a little scary to me. And I, in this context, was wondering, about your opinion, what is the ultimate, it's a silly question, but what is the ultimate goal of decolonization? Let's imagine that we can decolonize, we can decolonize our culture, we Ukrainian culture. I am thinking from within my system. So we, let's say, rethink Soviet heritage, then we rethink our attitude to Western world. We cannot orientalize us, but we don't drown in folklore and in this overheated folkloric stuff, which always happens also in Ukraine, often at least. So what can we, what are we left with? What should be our focus? What is a productive way of using this optics without a little bit misusing it? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, I mentioned it. I'm tired of speaking about this because it's everywhere now. They asked me to speak about this, so I didn't want to focus on this and repeat the same story. That's why I disown decoloniality at this point, because, as I said, I don't like the way it's developing now and the way everybody is appropriating it, from right-wing people to Putin, whoever. It's it completely lost its meaning. And that's why I'm not very interested in using the term any longer. I only use it in the original sense, and also in a very specific way when I talk about decolonizing frameworks of looking at things, decolonizing this modern colonial knowledge production system, so ways of perceiving the world, or like we were talking now, orientalizing, self-orientalizing, selling it to someone, in this capacity. So it has to do more with knowledge production and with ontology and being that comes from there, But when you say decolonizing, it's a completely different story. It's not the same. Decoloniality and decolonization are two different things. And that's why different words in English are used to describe that. So decolonization to me is it's a slogan. It's a very political one, a very powerful one. For example, if you're fighting for your independence from the colonizer, right? But it has very little to do with what I was trying to talk about today, because the colonial option emerges at the point when they know that it's not possible to decolonize. They realize in the early 1990s in Latin America, where they formulated this discourse first, that no, socialism doesn't bring happiness. So the socialist world is collapsing. It looks like neoliberalism will be everywhere. So in that sense, it's not a success. And then, although many countries became post-colonial and became independent, colonialism is still there, neocolonialism is still there. So your political independence does not guarantee you as a nation, let's say, right, independence in the way you think, in the way you interpret yourself and other people and, the world in general. So from that realization comes this idea that let's talk about decolonial option as a possibility of dealing with how people think, how their framings work, how they interpret the world. And that was the original kind of focus there, rather than political decolonization or fighting for independence. Because, the people are limited always. They always speak from their perspective and from their own context. At that point, of course, for Latin American thinkers, the idea was unimaginable that something like the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine could happen. So they were speaking already, kind of assuming that all of this is things of the past and nothing like that can happen again, And in that sense, it's very limited. But today, you're right. Very often, it's precisely the nationalist discourses, not only in Ukraine but in many other countries, that are trying to kind of hijack this. To me, it's very absurd. I can tell you why, because originally, who were the thinkers who first wrote about the decolonial option in the 1990s? They were Marxist people, they were leftists, and they were very, very far from any kind of nationalism or fundamentalism you can imagine. What happened was that these Marxists and leftists in Latin America, they also at some point discovered that there is indigenous people, there is indigenous thinkers, there is, also descendants of African slaves. And it's by learning from them that they enriched their original Marxist and leftist perspectives. While today it's the opposite. And that's what I mean when I say that decoloniality completely lost its original meaning, because it's going more and more and very often in the direction of the right. And to kind of finish this, no, it's not possible to reach an idealized decolonial situation, or decolonized, as you said, situation, right? The point of decoloniality is that it's a process and not a result. And you have to work on it all the time. And you can never say, now I reached this condition that everything's fine and we are fully and totally decolonial. No, we always write in all our works that it's not possible. It's not a result. It's a process. It's very self-critical, and it has to be self-critical. Otherwise, there is no point. And nobody has a recipe of saying, okay, this is the correct way of doing it, and I own it, and all other ways are incorrect. So in that sense, no, we cannot come up with a recipe. And in that sense, culture also doesn't kind of freeze there waiting to be resurrected or be returned to. And that's one of my issues with my colleagues, decolonial thinkers also, who I think are too much preoccupied with the past and with idealization of this pre-colonial past. And they're still very much focused on that. But it's a trap, because if you start doing that, then you risk to do what you were just describing, when people are too folkloristic, or they kind of have this romantic interpretation of how it used to be before, and they kind of assume that it can be restored somehow, which of course is not possible and also not needed. So I think in that sense, it's interesting that now more and more younger decolonial thinkers and artists included, they are shifting more towards the future. And I see this in Ukraine also, in many Ukrainian, thinkers and curators and art critics. So how can we imagine the future? How can we politically also imagine the future through doing art and through doing other things, And I think that shift is very important and should happen. And that's one of the decolonial gestures to me.
Thank you so much for a talk that I think so directly connects with many of the questions that we've been discussing today. I wanted to ask a little bit more about a word that you used at the very end, the trickster. I was really interested in this term to describe the actions of the decolonial artist. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the workings of that, this term trickster. I was thinking about, Dissent's tactics, which are the actions of the non-powerful. So how how you kind of imagine what those workings are of the trickster and how that differs from the concepts that we started with and critiqued, right, nonconformism. Because I can imagine there could be confusion, right? How is a nonconformist different from a trickster? And I think that difference is really important, as I understand, to your thinking. So yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. No, I mean, there's nothing wrong with nonconformist. It's just, for me, it's from the toolbox of modernity, coloniality. And I always, I'm very cautious not to use these terms because, I mean, being decolonial means, among other things, to not rely on the modern colonial kind of terms, concepts, you know, because this is what we want to decolonize. This is a very radical act of decolonization. So I rather would go and try to find these terms and concepts elsewhere. And trickster is one of these terms that is very important for the whole decolonial tradition of thinkers, activists, fighters, writers, whoever, you know, like artists. And there are many examples of this tricksterism. And the most famous one within the US would be Gloria Anzaldúa, Mexican American thinker, poet, you know, feminist, queer activist who wrote a wonderful book, a classic by now, which is called Borderlands, La Frontera, the New Mestiza. It's a book written in 2 languages, yeah, in English and Spanish. And there she actually works a lot with this concept of a trickster and what it means to be living in this borderlands, and not just to cross borders, but to be the border, because she says the border runs through you. And this is, I think, how many of us feel. And if we go to the folklore traditions that we criticized already today, but still, if we go to these indigenous traditions, to many other national, you know, ethnic national traditions, we find who are the tricksters. The tricksters come from many fairy tales or myths, and they are not strong enough to fight with their enemies, but they use their cunning. Yeah, they can outsmart somebody who is stronger than them. And so this is what we have to do in these situations. And I think that if before it was something like, you know, the artist fighting with the state, maybe with some ideological limitations, that now when it's in some cases no longer there, it's the artist or the curator dealing with this global market, you know, and trying to fit into it if possible or not, and trying to find ways to sell themselves, you know, and be popular, become popular. And it's very cynical, and in many ways it's not better, you know, for many artists than it used to be in the Soviet times. Conformism in that sense maybe refers more to your politics and to your ethics. And I would say that, to me, tricksterism also has to do more with survival and more with some ontological characteristics. But also, as I said, because I am a decolonial thinker, I prefer concepts and ideas and metaphors coming from this tradition and this struggle, rather than presumably neutral terms, you know, coming from mainstream art theory or whatever. That's just not, it's a foreign thing to me. I don't deal with such concepts. The same refers to being a trickster within the university, for instance, that you're still part of academia, you know, you do it, but then you question your role, you question the institution itself, and you do it from these decolonial cracks as a trickster who outsmarts the power. So you can mimic, sometimes you use mimicry, right? Again, coming from decolonial and post-colonial critique, or you can use other techniques. I would say that in Soviet Union, of course, it also existed in various forms, right? But I'm not sure that people had some specific name for it. That, for example, all of these artists would define themselves as nonconformists. Maybe they would use some other words, you know. So it's also a matter of who comes with kind of who coins this sort of terms, you know, and then they start living, and we agree with them or disagree with them.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. I wanted to ask, maybe kind of within the discussion, but also within this project, for many of us here, we're so concerned with the archives and kind of really substantiating or creating archives. Like there is so much focus on the name, right? Name and the artist, kind of really highlighting that, right, given texture. But at the same time, from this kind of point of view of decoloniality, like how can we balance that with perhaps decentering the individual, decentering this kind of, modernity's emphasis, well, it's been deconstructed many times, but on the artist, is there a way in which we can maintain that impulse with the emphasis on collective narrative and production? So if we think about something like the Dodge collection, where, I think there's been so much work done in creating this more horizontal field of connection, but there's still, individual artists, their works assigned to them, et cetera, et cetera. I think for our region, that's very important because it doesn't exist often, or, this kind of really textured archive of individuals. But it kind of goes against the logic of, the more recent efforts that emphasize collaboration, collectivity, solidarity. Perhaps if you have suggestions on how to maintain the two productively.
I don't know. I think it's a bit artificial because, if we're talking about the artists from the Soviet years, for instance, then in most cases it has to be individual, even if we don't like it or it's not decolonial. But they were in the context, and in that context, which was very modern colonial, it was very important to become the author with a capital letter and have a name, and so we cannot change this logic in the past in that sense. But of course, if we're speaking of contemporary artists, they very often do it on purpose. And today we have these collectives with no names, or they just have a collective name for themselves, but their individual names are not there. But then it's a different thing, because these are the artists who on purpose do that, because they question this framings. Like, for example, recently there was this wonderful Davra collective of Central Asian artists in Documenta 15. Where their names, of course, we know them, they're young artists who were invited for this project, but it was not important to keep their names in that particular configuration, let's say, and they were known as a collective. And in Soviet years, again, if we're speaking about this academic artists, with, of course, the names are important, but there were also those who were not called artists, as we said today, those who were relegated to the sphere of applied art or, I don't know, craft or something. And that would be an interesting question, because this would be like an example of decolonial artisanry, so to say, right? And this kind of thing that is not based on the modern colonial idea of authorship. And then how we deal with that, and how because in those cases we will not have names at all, and sometimes, right? But I'm not sure that this kind of objects would end up even in collections, because they are usually in very different collections, in anthropological, ethnographic, or whatever, but not art. So that is one of the ways, like when you shift these boundaries, when you question these modern colonial divisions of what kind of art ends up in which museum, right? And I think many artists also question that, because they precisely on purpose work with these objects, let's say, that are not considered art, and they make it part of their really complex conceptual works. And I think this is one way of messing up with these modern colonial divisions. But with archives, I don't know. Maybe we could play with the way of archiving in general, like maybe question very basic ways of doing this, or maybe doing it in different alternative ways, so that it's not one normative way and acceptable way, but many different ways. Well, you know better, because I mean, I'm not an art critic. I don't deal with this normally.
Thank you so very much. Thank you so very much, Madina, for this wonderful, wonderful presentation and most informative Q&A. I think it's time for us to go to the informal part of our program up in the lobby. So please give another round of applause to Madina.
Thank you very much. Thank you.